So far we've covered almost all the data types in JavaScript: numbers, booleans, strings, null, undefined, and arrays. Technically, even functions are a type of data in JavaScript as well. But I saved the best for last: objects. Objects are basically a composite type of data. An object is composed of other pieces of data, or even functions. You can create your own objects, store them in variables, and give them various properties and behaviors, and then use those objects in your code. It's quite powerful. Similar to an array, you can create an empty object using curly brackets. Now you can add properties to this object and read those properties as well. Just type the name of the object plus a period plus the name of the property. Then you can use that property just like any other variable. Those property names follow the same rules that variables, functions, and just about any other identifier in JavaScript follows. One way of looking at objects is that it's a variable that contains other variables. But objects are a great way to group information together in ways that would be very difficult to do otherwise. Let's go back to the hardware store example we created in the last video. I've copied this over into a new file called objects.js, which is now loaded by index.html. Now, in addition to item names, you will probably want to keep track of the cost of each item, its ID, and maybe a URL to an image of that item. How would you do that? Well, I've seen a lot of new developers make another array for each new property. Let's try that. You can follow along with this section or just sit back and watch how this goes. Let's just keep track of cost for now. We have an items array with the names of 8 items in it. I'll create another array called costs and populate that with the cost of each item in the array. I need to be very careful to make sure that the first element in costs represents the cost of the first element in items, etc. Okay, I've got those in, but here I've pushed a few more elements onto the items array. So I'll have to also push the prices of those in here too. Now this is starting to feel a little shaky to me. There's nothing really connecting these two arrays other than the fact that they're very carefully held in the same order. Every time I add something to or somehow change one array, I have to be sure to make the exact same change in the other one. Now imagine additional arrays like this for ID, picture URL, maybe a description, etc. It starts to feel like a house of cards just about to collapse. But I've been very careful here, so we should be okay, right? Let's change the list items function so that it prints out the name and the cost. We just concatenate those two values onto one long string. And now we test this. Uh-oh, that's not right. I specifically remember the hammer being $9.99 and the vise was the most expensive item. Now it's the cheapest. Nothing else looks quite right either, so let's go back to the code. Well, what happened was this line here, items sort. This totally rearranged the order of the items array so that it's no longer in sync with the costs array at all. And there's no easy way to keep these two things in sync. If we sort costs, it will sort that array differently than it sorts items, and will just make things even more random. The solution, as you might have guessed, is to use objects. This will let you consolidate all the data about a single item into a single package. Let's revert this back to where we were before we tried multiple arrays. You might want to open up your editor and start following along again. First, get rid of all these item names and restart with an empty items array. Now let's create the first item, an object. We'll give it some properties. First, the name and the cost. But then also let's add an ID and a string for holding an image URL, just to show you how you can consolidate all kinds of information on one object. Then we push that object onto the array. Now items index 0 will be this hammer object. You could continue to do this for each item, but there's another shortcut. Remember that you were able to specify all the elements in an array when you created the elements by putting them inside the square brackets. Well, you can do the same thing with objects. You can specify the properties when you create the object by placing the properties inside the curly brackets. Here's how that looks. Inside the brackets, I've listed each property name, followed by a colon, and then the value that I want that property to have. Here I've created a name property with the string value hammer. a cost property with the number value 9.99, and so on. Now you can actually even combine populating the array with populating each item. Just list each object inside the square brackets of the array, like so. So we start by opening the square bracket, then we create our first object, then a comma, then our second object, another comma, and the third object. So these are the 3 elements in the items array now. This may seem complex at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's a very concise and elegant way to create a bunch of objects. All you need to do now is fix up the listItems function so that it uses these new objects. Because each item is an object now, rather than just a string, you'll need to specify which property you want to log. Here I'll use the item's name property plus a cost and concatenate those into one long string. And let's see how that looks. Perfect. And because each object contains all the properties of that specific object, the list will never get out of sync. So now you know the very basics of objects, how to create them and give them properties and access those properties. Next, we'll look at a few more advanced operations with objects.